right. Welcome, everybody. So my name is Gwynn Krueger. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm the Director of Customer Experience at Meetup. And today we will be discussing the gender pay gap in the United States. This is the 7th installment in our Dismantling Social Injustice series, Meetup Live. If you have joined us in previous events, we've discussed mental health, urban policy, equal and civil rights for the transgender community. If you haven't joined us, welcome. We're excited to have you. Our goal is to continue fostering important conversations through events like these. So today we are going to have Shannon joining us for the conversation. Shannon's going to share the historical and structural disparities and factors such as pay secrecy, occupational segregation, pregnancy leave that contribute to the pay gap. From there, we will learn the necessary actions we must all take to help and support wage equity. So before we get into the conversation and intro of Shannon Williams, I'm going to just share our event guidelines. So just a few things. If you've joined us before, this is the regular deal, but if you haven't, the video is not, you will not appear in any video here. Shannon and I are the only people who are in video. Everything is recorded, but we can't hear you, we can't see you. We've muted everybody, so your audio, you don't have to worry, we can't hear you. And questions, if you have questions, feel free to submit them through the QA function at the bottom of your screen. As far as closed captioning, it is 100% available. To turn it on, click on the live transcription icon at the bottom of your screen and select your preference. And as far as our agenda for today, we're going to do a brief introduction of Shannon, and then we're going to have a discussion, and we'll open it up to some QA towards the end. So with that, I'm going to stop the sharing and bring Shannon and I up. Hello, Shannon. How are you?
Hello, Gwen. How are you?
I am well. I'm going to intro you now.
Okay.
Thank you so much thanks for joining us today. So Shannon is the director of the Equal Pay Today campaign, a project of equal right advocates, a campaign committed to fighting for equal pay and addressing the long-standing gender wage gap while working to combat its key contributors, pay secrecy, occupational segregation, lack of pay transparency, while engaging groups across women's legal and advocacy sectors. The campaign is an innovative collaboration of national and state-based advocacy organizations and was created to challenge the legal, policy, and cultural barriers at the local, state, and national level that keep women from achieving equal pay. Before coming to the ERA, Shannon was the director of policy and advocacy for the Urban League of Philadelphia, advocating for political equity and economic justice for communities of color, and the director of the Black Church Center for Justice and Equality, focused on restoring the social justice traditions of the Black church and engaging pastors to advance progressive policies for communities of color. Wow, that's an incredible bio. Well, we are lucky to have you here today talking about the wage gap and gender. So we want to kind of break down today's discussion into 3 buckets. We're going to talk about where we are today, then we're going to get into some context and some history. How did we get to where we are today? What are the contributing factors? And then we want to kind of talk about hope and what can we do to positively impact the future. So, Shannon, maybe take us through where are we today when it comes to the gender pay gap? Who is most affected? What is the pay gap?
Yeah, first, Gwen, thank you for having me today. I'm really glad to be here and be with everyone, especially after such a positive week so far. So when we say the gender pay gap, we're speaking about the gap between what men are paid and what women are paid, and refers to the average annual pay of all women who work full-time year-round compared to the pay of men. And these numbers come from US Census data. And when we think about who is most affected by this gap, of course, it's all women. But what we also know is that the gap gets much wider as you also factor in race. So we know there's gender discrimination, and we know that there's racial discrimination, and that each, tend to reveal themselves differently. But for women of color who sit at the intersection of gender and race discrimination, they're experiencing both at the same time, right? So the effects and the impact are compounded. So while white women definitely experience gender discrimination and have a wage gap of 79 cents for every dollar, Black and brown women are experiencing gender and race discrimination. Black women are paid on average to 63 cents for every dollar paid to the average non-Hispanic white man. For Native American women, it's 60 cents per dollar, and for Latinas, it's 55 cents per dollar. That's why it's so important that when we talk about the gender pay gap, we also look at the disparities between different demographics and not just look at it as one single issue. And white supremacy, which we've seen in mass amounts over the last few weeks and months, and gender discrimination go hand in hand when it comes to the toxic power structures that control our workplaces. And we have to address them both if we really want to see some real change.
Wow, yeah, there's a lot of different factors, and none of them are easy to address, right?
Right.
And so Shannon, you mentioned, the binary, looking at gender in the binary. Are there any studies on how non-binary or trans folks are impacted by the pay gap?
Yeah, so as it stands right now, there is no real data on how non-binary or trans folks are impacted by the pay gap. This is a real problem, right, that advocates across the country are working to address. The data we use to calculate the wage gap comes from the Census Bureau, and in the census, they ask people to give their sex, not their gender. So while the census does provide a comprehensive overview based on sex and race, it doesn't account for gender identity or disability or LGBTQI+ status. The census can also, just as a side note, give a limited picture because of the way it's been framed. It has made some communities fearful of participating, and rightfully so, based off of the language that's been used, especially given the scare tactics that were used during the last census. And these immigrant communities are some of the most vulnerable and most impacted by the wage gap. But luckily, President Biden already addressed this in his first day in office. One of his first executive actions yesterday reversed the Trump administration's unprecedented policy, excluding from the census immigrants who don't have citizenship documentation. So what we're doing, though, or what we're committed to doing at Equal Rights Advocates as a part of our Equal Pay Today campaign in collaboration with some of our partners, is adding days of observation and recognition for these groups that don't have data, that we don't have data for right now. So this year we'll be adding to our calendar of Equal Pay Days, days of action and awareness raising for LGBTQI+ workers, people with disabilities, and people without citizenship documentation. And we hope to build on that list for years to come. And we'll be calling on our government and employers to start focusing on collecting this data, because we can't fix what we can't see, right? And we need to know where these gaps exist and where the wage gap exists in these demographics so that we can really begin to address the pay discrimination that others face too.
Absolutely, yeah. And I guess you're referring to the question on the census about whether somebody's a U.S. citizen or not, right? And so now that's been removed, and so we will have more robust data. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Excellent. So what factors, I mean, we've kind of touched on them, but let's really get into what factors are contributing to this gender pay gap.
Yeah, so, okay, bear with me because I have a lot to say about this. All right, so we know that the issue of pay discrimination is not a problem that exists in a silo, and that there are a number of factors that contribute to gender and racial wage gaps. Let's talk about occupational segregation first, because that's one, sometimes that's kind of the forefront of people's minds. This phrase refers to the segregation of women and people of color into low-paying jobs, whether it's a field or industry that's dominated by women and people of color, that pays minimum wage or close to minimum wage, or whether it's within companies where women and people of color are most represented in the lowest paying roles and hold few of the high paying and high powered leadership positions. Occupational segregation also refers to the systemic undervaluing of jobs that are typically considered like women's work. This has become especially clear to everyone in the past year. The essential work that we all rely on to keep our society running and our economy afloat is severely undervalued and is severely underpaid. And these industries are generally dominated by women of color. Also, women of color are disproportionately represented in essential industries like restaurants, like in grocery stores, like in agriculture and food production, janitorial and domestic work, and the lowest paid hospital jobs. So at the same time that their work is being undervalued and that they're being severely underpaid, they're also the most in danger during this pandemic. They don't have the option to work from home and they're exposed every day. And then they have to go home and potentially expose their families, right? So this is part of the reason that Black and Brown communities have been so disproportionately hit by the pandemic, and a lack of health insurance in these low paid positions also means a higher risk of death if they do happen to get the virus, unfortunately. And these are fields that are also the least likely to offer paid sick days, meaning women often have to choose between going to work sick or staying home, losing their paycheck, which they obviously can't afford to lose, especially now. And they also don't have paid family leave, so they can't stay home to take care of sick children. They can't stay home to take care of elderly parents, which again, we're seeing an increase of now, especially with everything that's happening. And this is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly unfair, especially as we are recognizing them as the most essential workers in our society. We're really not treating them as essential at all. Women of color are literally right now keeping our society and keeping our economy running, and they should be paid accordingly.
Absolutely.
Also want to touch on pay transparency, but we can probably do that later when we touch on the legislation around equal pay that's coming up. But the next thing is the motherhood penalty. I'm not sure if you've heard of this, but it basically refers to the fact that when an employee decides to have a child, the career results are totally different for men than they are for women. Men are actually often seen when they have children, they often get a promotion or they get an increase in pay when they become parents, mainly in part because of that, outdated notion that men are the breadwinners. So their families are increasing, so they need that increase in pay. Meanwhile, the opposite happens for women. Our parental leave system is not set up fairly at all, and basically punishes women for deciding to have children. Most experience setbacks in their career, and we see a decrease in a mom's income over the next few years that's almost exactly proportionate to the dad's increase in income over those years. There's also a stereotype that women will be distracted by children in a way that men won't really be, and it can lead to damage that affects a woman for the rest of her career ultimately. Rather than getting that promotion or that pay raise that she would get if she was a man, she's really just stuck at her current position, stuck at her current salary. So she's basically just set back or staying stall where she could really be excelling. And the increasing financial impact follows her for the rest of her career and results in millions of dollars lost for many moms. A simple way to address this, though, is to make parental leave more even, give men more parental leave. It's the 21st century. Everybody's dividing responsibilities. There are no gender responsibilities anymore. So by acknowledging that men and women have equal roles in parenting, employers can stop punishing women for choosing to have children while rewarding men for doing so, right? And it can also help to create even more distribution of parenting responsibilities at home for men to just have the same amount of parental time off as women. And I just quickly want to mention just two more factors that we need to address when talking about pay discrimination. Women who experience pay discrimination are also more likely to experience more forms of gender and racial discrimination at work, and are more likely to be sexually harassed at work. So these issues go hand in hand. We need to make sure that we're addressing them all. And again, we can't always put the responsibility on women to speak out for themselves. Retaliation is common, especially in lower paying jobs, and it can lead to even worse discrimination, including financial consequences. And retaliation could mean that they're overlooked for a raise or a promotion. It could mean that they're being treated so poorly at work that they're ultimately just pushed out, or that they're just fired.
Yeah. Wow, that's a lot. Back, and thank you for really clearly taking us through it and addressing, some really sensitive issues around, privilege and gender and race, and how it's really impacting lives. So what legislations are in place today to protect women from any of what you just described in terms of discrimination?
Yeah, so this is where I wanted to touch on the pay secrecy and kind of the pay transparency. A lot of time people are told that they can close the wage gap on their own by being transparent with their coworkers about how much they get paid. And while that is helpful, and we do encourage folks to do that, that's not really fair. It puts the burden on individual workers who are sometimes putting their jobs at risk by sharing that information, depending on where they work. But the issue is a lot bigger than them. We need changes on the whole company level, on the state and government level, and at the federal level. We need the government to really start requiring employers to report how much they pay their employees, according to position, according to gender, race, ethnicity, LGBTQI+ status, disability, immigration status, all of that. And California is starting to do this, at least with sex, race, and ethnicity, with a law that my organization, Equal Rights Advocates, really helped to pass last year. It requires employers to report the information to a government agency so that the government can start enforcing equal pay laws without relying on individuals, workers to come forward, and report to government agencies that are experiencing pay discrimination. So great. That system isn't fair because it puts the burden again entirely on the worker who's the victim of this discrimination in the first place, and then they have to file an official government report and go through it's a long and strenuous process that we don't even have time for in this session, but it can take years. And it could also impact the way that they've been treated at work. Even though it's illegal for employers to retaliate against someone who files discrimination complaint, it unfortunately happens all the time. So enforcing equal pay laws this way doesn't necessarily work all the time because many workers can't afford to go through that, so they just don't report it. Until it's required by law, companies who are serious about wanting fair pay for their employees really need to start being mindful about collecting this information on their own. And kind of, the first step would be to start by fixing the pay discrimination that's happening under their own roof. Some large companies are starting to do this. They're setting the stage for others by being transparent about where their discrepancies exist for their own employees and sharing how they are planning to address those discrepancies. And then there are some other pieces of legislation, some I'm sure we'll cover a little later, but we need to make sure that the big thing, we need to pass the Paycheck Fairness Act immediately. That would be something that is extremely helpful. And then, state laws requiring more paid and laws that require more paid sick days for all workers, especially given the climate that we're in now.
Yeah, and the Paycheck Fairness Act, that's something that is that in Congress now? Is it a federal legislation?
Yeah, it's making its way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Got it. So, kind of stepping back and looking at the context of all of this, I mean, you really touched on a lot, and I think you've touched on where the, historical background, how did we get here? Can you kind of get a little bit more into what has contributed to where we are, the historical background, and kind of how this has all evolved through the years, and like what increases may have happened, or like has the gap closed at certain points? Tell us the story there.
Yeah. So there's the obvious, right? Which is decades long carryover of ridiculous sexist ideas that women should be parenting more than men, that certain fields are, again, women's work, which, by the way, like what is considered women's work almost always pays less. And I'm thinking about teachers, I'm thinking about domestic care workers, I'm thinking about restaurant servers, right? But on a less obvious level, and where we can really fight for change is first, we're way overdue for a federal increase to the minimum wage. You've probably heard the stats along the way, but if minimum wage were adjusted to keep up with inflation, it really should be like $24 right now. At this point, we're just trying for 15. And luckily, President Biden has hinted that he is on board for this increase. We also have to talk about the sub-minimum wage for tip workers. Many restaurant servers and bartenders across the country are still being paid just $2.13 an hour, and they should be paid at least minimum wage plus the tips that they earn. And then, again, women dominate the restaurant service industry, and relying on tips exposes them to all kinds of customer mistreatment, especially sexual harassment, which we've actually seen an alarming increase in sexual harassment for restaurant workers since the pandemic began, which is incredibly unfortunate. But we need to recognize that the sub-minimum tip wage, and this is kind of the historical aspect for tip workers, has a legacy tied to slavery. It began during Jim Crow when legislation was passed allowing restaurants to not pay their servers instead of making them rely on tips. This was because restaurants just simply don't want to pay Black servers who were recently emancipated. And that trickled itself down. So honestly, not much has changed since then. We went from $0 an hour to $2.13 an hour in 140 years. So it's taken a bit, but it's time, we really need to focus on ending that sub-tip minimum wage for workers, and really, trying to do those types of legislative actions so that we can really help to close that wage gap, especially for some of those industries that fall within that bucket.
Yeah, wow. And, I guess like as far as looking, really legislatively and as a society really looking at like and acknowledging that there is a discrepancy, when was the first law passed to really address and acknowledge like, hey, there's there's some, unfair treatment between genders and in race and in our society? Like when did that start happening?
Yeah, so on the federal level, there's the Equal Pay Act that was signed into law in 1963, and that has since just really been weakened by loopholes, adverse court rulings, all of that, and basically just resulting in a protection that's much less effective and impactful than Congress had originally intended it to be. But there is a piece of legislation, and we mentioned this at the top, and a few times throughout, but that would be a really important part to addressing the wage gap if it were to pass, and that is the Paycheck Fairness Act. So the Paycheck Fairness Act would do four main things. One, it would increase pay transparency by making it illegal for employers to retaliate against workers for discussing their pay with colleagues. It would make it illegal for employers to ask a job applicant about their salary history, what they're currently making, what they used to make, all of that. And again, this would help to break the cycle of unfair pay, because using prior pay to set someone's new pay just allows for discrimination to follow women and people of color from job to job, right? Third, it would require employers to prove that pay disparities exist for legitimate and job-related reasons. So it puts the burden on the employer to say this pay disparity is there because of the job that it is, right? And then it would lastly, it would remove obstacles for workers who want to join forces against discrimination in a class action lawsuit. So having something like this in place would be a tremendous plug to fill in some of those loopholes for that Equal Pay Act.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And I think like, I think you touched on this, but I think one more time for, all the folks out there, like, why has it been so difficult to close the gap? What stands in our way here?
Yeah, so I appreciate this question because it's so important to the work that we do. And I'm really glad that we have an opportunity to talk about it and address it here. There are so many myths and misconceptions about the gender wage gap. I can't even. But the first and probably the most apparent and obvious one is really just that it doesn't exist, that it's fake. But the people who seem to think that the wage gap is a myth and that it's not real are typically the ones who are benefiting from the gap to begin with. So just want to highlight that. But we know the reality is the wage gap does exist, and that this gap does get wider for women of color who, again, happen to find themselves sitting at the intersection of gender and race discrimination. And especially in our current climate with the pandemic, with Black women earning 60 cents on the dollar to their white non-Hispanic male counterparts, with 80% of Black mothers being the sole, or primary breadwinners for their household, with Latinas being the breadwinners in over 3 million US households and 38% of those households falling below the poverty line, the gender wage gap is a very real thing. And these disparities are really being felt. They're very harmful, and they're not just harmful to women. They're harmful to their families, and they're harmful to our communities as a whole, right? Imagine what would be happening if these women were getting paid what they should be, and what that could mean for the advancement of communities. Another misconception about the wage gap is that women are paid less because of the jobs that they choose, that women tend to choose lower paying careers and do so more than men, which in general is just pretty insulting, actually, because it's basically insinuating that women just make bad choices for themselves. And that's just simply not the case. The reality is that the wage gap exists in nearly every industry and nearly every profession, regardless of education and regardless of years of experience. And women in female-dominated jobs still face a pay gap in comparison to their male counterparts. And again, when you compound that gender and race piece, that gap just gets wider. Also, it's important to note the education piece, which is another misconception, that education or more education would actually solve the problem and solve the issue of the wage gap. Not necessarily the case. We still see gender and race wage gaps for women with postgraduate degrees, with law degrees, with medical degrees, across all professions and across all education levels. For example, the average income for a Black woman with a bachelor's degree is about $46,000 less per year than what a white non-Hispanic man makes with an associate degree.
Hmm.
So education is not this great equalizer that people try to make it out to be, although education is great. But yes, still not the great equalizer. And lastly, it's really just a big misconception that the wage gap exists because women just don't ask for raises, and that we need to ask for raises more often, or that we need to learn how to negotiate better. Also not the case. Recent studies really disprove this, showing that women ask for raises just as often as men. We're just less likely to get them. So.
Got it. And just you've touched on this a little bit, but I kind of want to just ask this directly. Like, why are different races paid differently? And in that, I know there was a stat that Latinas or Latinx folks are paid the lowest. And can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, honestly, it's just that systemic racism that we just can't seem to get ourselves around. I'm hoping for better in the years coming forward, especially with a couple of changes that have happened. But ultimately, it's just that systemic racism piece.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
So, with that, I mean, address like pointing to systemic racism and the construction and of gender and all these factors around folks choosing jobs that like it's choice and negotiation and the power dynamics. How do we move forward? How do we move forward with this? What are some ways that we can advocate for equal pay? And I think also like a follow-up question to that is, how can folks who have privilege really use the privilege to advocate for folks who may not have that same privilege?
Yeah, oh, love that follow-up. So first, we could all be working together. That's how we can be advocating. We can ask our company individually, we can ask our company to collect pay data based on gender, race, and ethnicity. We can support legislation that will require that. Again, this is something that I imagine is going to be coming up very soon, and everybody can keep a buzz and an ear out for it, but we can push Congress to pass the Paycheck Fairness Act and also raise the minimum wage to at least $15 an hour. I actually have an easy way for you all to do this. If you join the Equal Rights Action Team through my organization's website, equalrights.org, we send weekly action alerts on ways you can email, tweet at, or call your senators and representatives about important legislation, including the policies that I mentioned. The URL is equalrights.org, and then you just click on what you can do, and then you sign up. And then one thing that everyone can do within their companies is to talk to each other and to talk to their colleagues about pay. This is a great way for white allies and for men to really help advocate for equal pay for their women colleagues and people of color. And for those that maybe this is not an issue for you, or you don't think it's an issue for you, your silence is not helpful. So if you're recognizing that there is a disparity, be an ally, have these conversations, talk to your employers again, and then be a voice in this fight. This is not just a women's issue. This is an issue, right? For the women that are earning less, that have families, that have children, this is a childcare issue. This is a health issue. Like, it trickles itself down. This is a community issue. Imagine again what communities or what certain communities could look like, especially underserved communities, would look like if the women that were in those communities were being paid exactly what they should be paid, and if they were being paid fairly. So just if you're looking to get into this fight, be an ally. If you don't feel like this is something that is attached to you, or maybe you're being paid fairly, or you feel like you are, somebody is not. So really, talk to people, talk to your colleagues, and really just work on being an ally.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think last question for you, and then we'll go to some QA. We have a lot of questions from our audience. What are some initiatives that you're working on right now? You mentioned the work that you have going with the Equal Pay Today campaign. Is there anything like really specific that you're working on, like literally right now? What do you got going?
Yeah, so thank you, because I love to plug this. One of our big goals around this work is being able to raise awareness around the gender wage gap by observing and highlighting equal pay days. So just as a general overview, equal pay days are the day in the year that a woman must work to earn what the average man earns in the previous year alone. And as we discussed, the gender wage as you factor in race. So throughout the year, we work to really highlight, amplify, and bring awareness to this issue by observing things like Asian women's equal pay day, women's equal pay day, Black women's equal pay day, Native women's equal pay day, and Latina equal pay day. And again, the numbers that we have come from the census data, and that's how we figure out where these dates fall within the calendar year. So for example, Black women's equal pay day isn't until August 3rd. That means that August 3rd of 2021 is what a Black woman had to work to make what a white non-Hispanic man made in just the last year alone. And then it gets worse from there. Native women's equal pay day is in September. Latina equal pay day is in October or November. So like, that's at the end of the year. That's almost a whole other full year worked to catch up to what their male counterparts made in just the year by itself. So we really focus on raising awareness on those days. And if anybody is interested in being a part of those, please visit equalrights.org, and we'll be happy to tie you into a lot of these days.
Yeah, awesome. And I know that you have a bunch of panels that are up on YouTube that you hosted with folks as part of each of those initiatives, and really get into kind of a deep dive in the different segments of folks who are impacted and women that you're supporting with these days. So plug for that as well.
Thank you. Yeah, we on each equal pay day, we do a social media storm. So for an hour, we tweet, we hashtag, we provide resources, we contact our legislators, everything, just to make sure that we're raising awareness for that day. And then again, like you mentioned, we also try to have a supplemental event that people can attend to learn more, to hear about what's entailed, and then to hear more about what they can do.
Yeah, awesome. I got a lot out of them. So definitely plugging them for everyone here.
Oh, thank you.
So let's take some questions. So we have Melinda asking, does equal pay require transparency in pay? Everyone knows everyone else's salary. I think that can feel a little unintuitive for folks. So, you kind of got into it. Do you have anything else to say about the benefit there?
Yeah. So it's hard, right? I'm from, I can remember my grandmother saying, baby, don't you discuss your pay with nobody. So it's hard, right? To kind of break from that, but it's so important because that's really, without this data being collected, that's really how we can determine, where these gaps are, that somebody is being paid unfairly, especially with the same qualifications, at the same education level, in the same job space. So yeah, the talking and kind of breaking that and just being transparent about what you're being paid versus what somebody else is being paid versus what somebody else is being paid, and having those conversations, even in your groups, or even in your friend group, just something as small as that is helpful, because it at least brings the conversation to the forefront of your mind. And then you're kind of thinking about it all the time. Like, okay, well, so-and-so said they're paid this much. And I know we have the same qualifications. So, and the same experience. So why is it that I'm not? So it at least brings you to draw those questions. But I appreciate that question because I understand how hard it is.
Yeah, totally. I also relate to that as well. So just don't talk about those kinds of things, but
right.
Transparency brings it the light, shines a light on where it's not equal. And so that's really healthy. So Aubrey asks, California's Fair Pay Act just began on January 1st. Should other states follow suit, or can they further improve upon these requirements? If states do not follow suit, should Congress step in and force companies to publish this information? Perhaps especially if they contract with the US government or get paid in tax dollars.
Yeah, so your question is actually the perfect answer. Yes, Congress should be acting, but if Congress is not going to, then we need to be doing things at the state level. California's law is great. I think everything can always be improved on, right? So we can always add things that will make a law better. But I do think that California's law is a good model. And then, yes, you should be calling on, if your state does not have these protections, if your state does not have an equal pay law, if your state does not do these things, then yes, you should be advocating for your state to have these, and you should be advocating for legislation at the state level that can really, offer that impact. And my recommendation would be to, contact the organizations that are in your state that are working on this. We probably know many of them. So if anybody is interested in doing that work and really being mobilized around this issue, I am happy to direct you to the right people and really get your voice into this fight, because that's going to be so important, especially in the upcoming weeks and months and years as we're continuing to fight for this.
Yeah, well, it's also strike while the iron's hot, and it is hot right now.
Exactly.
It's just
Exactly.
time to get going. Yvonne asks, says, it's good that you're calling attention to Black and brown women. What about the effects on Asian and Middle East women?
Yeah, great question. So we do highlight Asian women for Equal Pay Days. They are, that Equal Pay Day is February 23rd this year, and we do make it a point to, of course, highlight that. We're also, one of the things that we don't have information on, which is one of the pieces that we're really focused on incorporating, as you these are the big bucket demographics, right? Asian women, Black women, Native women, Latino women. But people know there's different ethnicities and different groups, subgroups within those groups that we just don't have information for. But we know that, if you're that Afro-Latinas are paid less than, like their equal pay day is probably later than we observe Latina equal pay day. So we're just really focused on, trying to make sure that we have enough data, have enough resources, have enough research so that we can really get to a point where we are able to really parse out by demographics so that we can see where these gaps are and work to really close them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, it's about shining the light, right? It's like society. Let's talk about about society.
Exactly. Let's talk about it.
Awesome. So let's see. MG asks, can you speak to any discrimination that exists for women who choose not to have children? How might this impact their career?
That is a good question. And I don't know if I have a good answer for you for that. But now you're making me think that maybe there's another segment that we need to focus on without children. I probably should write that down.
That's a great takeaway.
Yeah. I appreciate your question, because again, see, now we're talking about it, and now you've raised awareness and you shined a light, and I'm going to take that back.
Yeah, thanks, MG. All right, Cheryl asks, what are the discussions re the effect of the gender gap on retirement benefits? Lower pay results in lower contributions to Social Security. Many teachers are excluded from Social Security, which I did not know that, as well as other types of retirement funds, IRA, Roth, etc., and matching funds by employers.
Yeah, I didn't know that some teachers were barred from getting Social Security either.
But you're sounding out a little bit, Shannon. Sorry.
Oh.
Now I can hear you better.
Okay. Yeah, I was saying I didn't know that teachers were barred from getting Social Security either. So I'd love to talk to you offline about that, because that sounds problematic. But it's just like you said, if you're not earning what you should be earning and reporting the earnings that you should be earning, then it's going to trickle down into your future retirement benefits, what you're getting in your Social Security check, all of those benefits that are attached to payments that come from your income, is going to impact. So think about the money you're losing throughout your lifetime by not getting equal pay while you're working. It'll just trickle down.
Yeah, it compounds, right?
Right.
And even like I was reading something about the gap. It's like $900,000 at the end of once a women hit retirement age, men hit retirement age. I don't know if that's the right number, but even that amount, if you were to be able to invest that, think about how much more retirement you would have. So anything is makes a difference. Let's see, M asks, hi Shannon, thanks for speaking on this topic of equal pay. I've read some news articles saying many moms are quitting their jobs during the pandemic or reducing work hours. What are your thoughts about this trend, and does this set us back in the push for equal treatment and equal pay? What would you suggest to someone who is thinking about taking this path?
Back at you. Yes, this is a problem. And this is something that we are currently looking at Equal Rights Advocates, along with some of our partner organizations, because this is something that's kind of new to us too, right? We've never been in a pandemic before, so we don't know. But it's even happening, we're seeing it happen with colleagues, we're seeing it happen in families, like people are leaving work, women are leaving work. At this point, there's so many, I can't really remember the number, and I wish I could. And I'm sure it's probably in one of those articles that you read, but women are leaving the workforce at disproportionate numbers from men, because there's no childcare, virtual learning. I don't know anything about virtual learning, but from what I hear, I don't want to know. It sounds like a terrible mess. So, and very hard on parents. So what's the alternative? You can't have your kid not go to school. So now you have to leave work so that you can focus on making sure that your kid has the education that they need, right? So yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned this, because this is something that we're looking at in real time right now. Because what's going to be the after effects of this, right? Like when things kind of open back up and we get back to some regularity, what's this going to look like? We're all learning this as we go. What's going to happen? Who's going to fill these jobs back? Are these women going to get these jobs back? What's going to happen when they want to get back into the workforce or have to get back into the workforce? So yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because this is a conversation that we're having. This is a conversation that needs to be had, and this is something that we're going to have to figure out, and we're going to have to figure it out soon.
Yeah, lots of work to do. Amir asks, it sounds like we need to advocate for governments to encourage transparency among companies to collect data on gender identity, sex, immigration status, etc. Seems like a reasonable and easy thing to do, but how can we as citizens combat the partisan divide on this issue and encourage politicians to change their thinking on this issue?
That's a great question. And Amir was your name. It sounds like you want to be an advocate, and it sounds like we should be calling you for whatever state you're in to help us with this fight. So I love that you asked that question. But yes, find the organizations in your state that are work with us. Call your legislators, find out which legislators are not for pay transparency, for collecting this data. And then, start small too. Ask your own company if they collect this pay data. Ask your company if they don't collect it, if they should start collecting it, or if they want to start collecting it. Start having those conversations, start having those dialogues. And then again, just nothing really beats boots on the ground. So, as organizations are kind of fighting for this, as organizations like mine, Equal Rights Advocates, as we're fighting for these things, join us. Join us on lobby days when you can actually go into the capitals again. Call your senators, tweet at them. They're there for you. So, yeah, make sure that you're being as much of an advocate as possible.
Yeah, and I think just want to share that we'll be posting a recording of this talk on our blog, which is meetup.com/blog, and we'll post the links to some of the resources and to everything that you're mentioning here, so that people can link into it. We're gonna keep going with some QA. This is a really interesting question. MG asks, which countries have the smallest gender wage gap and what are they doing right? Not sure if you have that data, but.
Yeah, that's a good question. We know, in the short answer, the UK has they're pretty advanced and they're pretty progressive, and they have a pretty good model of how this is done. Off the top, that's the one big country one big area that I know that's doing a pretty good job. And I know that just in our own work that we kind of look to that one too.
Great. Yeah.
They're making some good strides.
Cool. Dara asks, is it true that when men are hired in jobs that have historically been dominated by women, like nursing, that the men often get paid more than women?
Yes. Yes, it is true. Again, even in female dominated areas, and this goes back to the myth that the pay gap doesn't exist, right? Or that it's because of the jobs that women choose that are attributed or that attribute to the wage gap. No, even in those female dominated jobs, men are still paid more than women. So yes, very true.
Yeah, and the data speaks for itself. I mean, it's out there, and yeah, there it is. Lisa asks, on the topic of better negotiation, are there sources of data to help women and people of color in their conversations?
Yeah, there are, and I don't have the links, but I'm happy to share them with you, Gwen, and you can share them out. But there are links that offer trainings for women for negotiations. There are webinars that offer negotiation training. With the pandemic and people working from home, we actually saw a little uptick in negotiation kind of trainings, seminars, webinars, and stuff. So yeah, they do exist and they're out there, and I'm happy to find a way to share those with you.
Awesome. Yeah, share them along and we'll put them in the blog post. Cool. Let's see. Lynn asked, have resources such as the Glassdoor website helped to reveal pay disparities? And could other sources of disclosure of pay rates by demographics help to increase awareness of pay gap issues?
Yeah, if companies, even something as small as companies putting salary ranges in their job descriptions would help to close the wage gap. And then again, things like, not relying on prior salary to set someone's new salary. So outlawing things like that, salary history bans, again, the transparency piece, and that Glassdoor component, that falls into the transparency piece, right? Just being transparent about what a job offers, what a job pays, and then being able to kind of, talk about that. But then even in those job descriptions, listing the jobs or listing the salary ranges for people to see.
Yeah.
And being transparent about that.
Yeah. Transparency. It's a huge
tool. The word of the day.
Right? Michelle asked, what have the major labor unions been doing that has been effective?
So, I know of the major labor unions more from an advocacy standpoint, so I can speak to that. They're very much in this fight with everyone, and even though unions, the pay for union workers, that union rate is kind of prime. They're still great advocates for the issue of fair pay. So yeah, they're great allies. They're great partners in this work. And yeah, and do amazing mobilization work too with this.
Absolutely. Diane asked, is there any research out there on the effect of age for women in equal pay? That is, does age discrimination exacerbate in the pay gap?
No, but well, okay. So in terms of data, that's also something that we're looking to add to our list of things. So, things that we need more data on, and age is one of them. So I'm really glad that you kind of mentioned that, because it makes me think that other people are thinking about it and that it is something that has to happen. So yeah, that's also on our list of things that we need a little bit more research on, that we need a little more solid data on, so that we can really work to advocate for that piece too.
Cool. MG asked, hi MG again. If we suspect we are being underpaid compared to our colleagues, what steps can we take to uncover and fix this?
Yeah, so a couple things. You can address your employer. There's also, I know there's a fear of companies retaliating against you for doing that. And that's why you can always come to an organization like mine, Equal Rights Advocates. We have litigators. There are litigators that are that are part of legal advocacy organizations that do this. And should something happen or anything, they would love to help you out with that. But if that's something that you think if that's something that you think is happening, address it head on. But if there is a fear of retaliation, please feel free to feel like you can contact a legal advocacy organization that focuses in fair pay and equal pay, and they would love it. They would love to help.
Wow, that's awesome work that you're doing to just provide that service and support to folks who may feel like that's they're scared to bring something like this up and to light in an organization. Amazing work. Alice asks, I'm seeing a lot of solutions in the marketplace that promise to help companies support pay equity. Do you see these as a solution to this issue, or at least something that could be helpful, or are these solutions not particularly valuable?
I think it's something that can be helpful. I think ultimately, at least for me, nothing's better than putting something in law, right? And making it solid. So yeah, I think that those solutions are helpful. And I think that it's great that companies are actually being receptive to those solutions. But I think that the legislative fix is probably the best way to go. And then on the back end, should we get some of these legislative fixes, making sure that we're monitoring the implementation of these legislative fixes so that we know that employers are doing the right thing. And if they're not, then we can check it.
Got it. What's an example of one of these solutions that are not governed?
Yeah. I think it's mostly encouraging your employer to collect data if they're not going to do it on their own. I'm glad you asked that follow-up when. So yeah, doing it if they're not going to collect this, doing it on their own, being mindful and making their own kind of fair pay pledge to themselves.
Got it.
Yeah, and then on the back end, it's just kind of little things like not having retaliation policies at work that make it not okay for you to talk about your pay with other coworkers, and then things like that.
Right. So having accountability, legislation that covers accountability. Yeah, that's huge. It's great to take the initiatives, but also having the accountability keeps it fair.
Exactly.
Alice asks, Alice just asked that last question. Sudeep asks, has there been any comparisons between different states on the issue of equal pay related to race and gender? Are some states doing better than others?
Yes, that is a great question. And I will be more than happy to share a link for this. There are some states that are doing better than others, and some states are just more progressive than others, California being one of them. Not so shocking because it's California, but California being one of them. Colorado has great equal pay laws. Maryland is headed in the right direction. I will flag on the bad side of these states, Mississippi doesn't have an equal pay law at all, and they've been trying. We're actually trying again. So yeah, there are some states that are kind of the models, some states that are terrible, and then other states that fall kind of in the middle, where we can be where there are equal pay laws intact, but there's always something that can be done to make it better. And we're focused on that. But yes, that's a great question.
Amazing. Rebecca, this is a great question too. Rebecca asks, how do you include merit into the conversation?
Yeah. And I guess we can't ask.
Like merit increases, like getting a yearly merit increase to your salary. Like what impact does race and gender have on that?
Yeah, I like that question because it's something that we look at, but probably not as deep. Yeah, so there is how do I put this? So your pay, if you're coming in, if you're coming in already low, right? Any merit increase that you would get would still kind of keep you low because you're already coming in at at that lower level. I like that question because it's making me think about other things that probably we need to be looking at to kind of to tackle that. So who's that? Sadeep?
That was Rebecca, but
Rebecca.
We'll keep these questions for you in a script.
Yeah, I like that question, Rebecca, because we think about it kind of in the broad scheme. Like if you're already being paid low and you get a merit increase, then regardless of what that merit increase is, it's just an increase on a low pay, on a low, or on an already low to begin with salary. But yeah, that's a good question.
It is a good question. We got a couple more, and then we're gonna wrap. So Kenneth asks, is there evidence to suggest that in industry states which have pay transparency that the gap closes?
There is research out there that says that if your state has that pay transparency not only closes, and there's a great report that I'll definitely make sure to share that came out of the pandemic, but one that was done, I believe, by the Institute for Women's Policy Research, but that says that's specifically focused on states with pay transparency and how that closed the wage gap for Black women, and how that actually is an important factor in closing the gender and race wage gap. So yes, there is evidence that those types of implementations do work, and I'll love to share that link and research with you that came out.
Awesome. Yeah, it'd be super interesting to see what the impact is on the transparency. All right, so this is the last question. Tammy, wrapping it up for us. How successful are workers who try renegotiating their salaries with their current employers? Is the best method for pay equity to join another firm?
You kind of cut out a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
So how successful are workers who try renegotiating their salaries with their current employers? Is the best method for pay equity to join another firm?
So that's an interesting question. Because I feel like my personal ideas is conflicting with my professional ideas. Depending on where you are, leaving might only exacerbate the problem, which I hate to say, because who knows what the other side, what's the other side? What's that saying? Grass is greener. So who knows? Obviously the first step is, negotiations, and negotiate a better salary, especially if you're coming in with like some of these data points, right? Like if you are having those conversations with people at work and that people of same qualifications, same education level, same expertise, same years of experience or time of experience are being paid more than you, and you can, fact check that, then yes, go in there and do that. And then, know that you do have other outlets, you do have other resources, and there is somebody who, for lack of a better phrase, has your back. If there is some type of legal action that you need to take from something like that, I would never suggest someone to leave and go somewhere else, I guess. But yeah, I feel like that might be the best starting point. And if this is, an actual, happy to talk more about this offline in a more personal space too, if that's necessary.
Yeah, well, that's amazing, because I think that that's a great way to end, because I think, first of all, thank you so much, Shannon Williams, for coming and speaking to us tonight.
Thank you.
It's just an honor to have you here. And I think, like, as you said, just knowing that there are folks and advocacy groups that are doing the work that you're doing to help people who have questions and who are legitimately, want to advocate for themselves or advocate for others in the workplace. like just knowing that's a place, you know, the equal rights advocates exist and a place to start and get that information. It's huge. It's huge. And I learned a lot just from having this chat with you today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.
This was fun.
Yes, it was fun. It was fun. And I hope we get to chat again.
Me too.
I'm going to go ahead and just flash this so everybody, before we go, we want you to get out your phones. This is very exciting. We launched our first ever podcast, Keep Connected with our CEO, David. And it's on every podcast platform, Spotify, Apple Music, all of it. So we want you to kind of scan this if you can, or just go and search it and check it out. There's a really great episode that launched yesterday with Meetup organizer Edward Zia. It's our CEO, David, talking to organizers, community experts, just all about Meetup, community, togetherness, connection, and it's really special. Loved the first one with John O'Bacon, was awesome. And Edward is one of our all-star organizers, so excited to check that one out as well. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. This was an amazing conversation. I learned a lot. I'm sure we all got a lot out of it. And Shannon, thank you again for your time, sharing your insights with us. If you would like to see a recording of this and get the links to what we referred to here, please check out our Community Matters blog at meetup.com/blog. And thank you again for joining us. Everybody stay well, be well, and have a wonderful rest of your week.